Hey guys, what is up? This is Philbo. We are looking at the Lightning Thorn Explosion Mage build in Undecember. This build is going to feature two of the most dominant abilities in the game. Thorn Explosion, which is going to be our primary ability. It dishes out massive amounts of damage in a concentrated area. And then we will also be using Charge Release as the activated skill, which is going to support Thorn Explosion by adding the shock debuff, increasing damage to the enemies that it affects, and by clearing out large packs of enemies, since Thorn Explosion does damage in a smaller area. One quick note about this build is it is a shorter range build because cast distance on Thorn Explosion is definitely shorter than a lot of other spells in the game, but the damage that it dishes out is well worth it. And if you're willing to get up a little bit closer to enemies to dish out insane amounts of damage, then this is going to be the build for you. So let's go ahead and jump right into the details of the build. So let's talk about Thorn Explosion. Thorn Explosion, you're going to set down an area of effect that shoots out small thorns every 0.3 seconds for 3 intervals. And then a large thorn is going to shoot up out of the ground after that. So be aware that the damage does not happen all at once. It takes time. So if we look at the Scarecrow, you'll see every time his head gets knocked back, that's when it's being damaged. Thorn Explosion does have a bleed chance. That's going to get removed in this build though, because we are converting it to lightning. But don't worry, the bleed is not that much damage, so losing it is not that big of a deal, and element damage scales extremely well. We also want to match to our charge release so that every damage increase we get for elemental and lightning damage will be shared between Thorn Explosion and charge release. The bleed is going away. We do have that first thorn attack we talked about, and there's a thorn interval of 0.3 seconds. This is going to happen 3 times, and then when the 3 explosions have occurred, the second thorn attack will happen, which is that large thorn that we saw a few moments ago and hits for a very large amount, more than the first 3 thorn explosions combined. The full amount of damage is not going to happen until about a second after Thorn Explosion has been cast and placed on the ground. Moving on to the awakenings, we are going to be awakening to source. We are going to get a huge damage increase through 2 lines of amplification, up to 25% amplification each. This is insane. Moving on to charge release. Charge release, they will hit the enemy and then explode. So there will be 2 hits occurring, the initial projectile strike and then the explosion. We're going to be able to apply the shock debuff and get an additional 20% damage to enemies that are affected by the shock debuff. Also, you get an additional 2% projectile damage amplification per additional projectile. So we want to get as close to, if not 20 projectiles as possible. Do note that the projectile damage amplification only amplifies the damage on the initial strike, not the explosion. For awakenings, there are 2 awakenings that I think are good here. The first awakening is going to be Source, and this is the one that I go with because this one is the best for farming and still gives a damage increase through projectile count. But what happens is, instead of shooting out in kind of like a cone like you're seeing here, what is going to happen is you're going to basically be shooting charge release projectiles in nearly a 360-degree angle. So you'll see what this looks like because this is what I have. So as you're casting, charge release is going all over the place, and there's like a slight area behind you that it tends to stray away from, but still for the most part it's near 360-degree coverage, which is great for mapping. And that is the awakening that I go with because mapping and farming in this game is the majority of what you're doing. The other option that I think is good would be continuous shock, because in this build, the primary damage, the bulk of the damage is going to come from Thorn Explosion. And shock effect, if you were to get 25% additional shock effect here, that would be an extra 5% damage amplification from shock, which would amplify not just your charge release damage, but also your Thorn Explosion damage. However, I think Source with the 360-degree coverage is just the better rounded awakening. It does increase damage to charge release, and it does make for a much better farming experience. I can assure you of that. So this is the one that I choose, Source. For attack enhance, I go with release element for a big element damage amplification buff. For defense enhance, we're going with tenacious regeneration to get essentially an additional health potion, so you recover a portion of your maximum HP and then get a big HP regeneration per second. And for my movement skill, my preference is roll. I think roll is about the best movement skill in the game. It has the lowest cooldown and it gets 2 use counts by default and then increases your movement speed. And it's just a really, really nice movement skill. So I like this one. And then the last slot that you have on your primary bar is optional, but I use a second movement skill, penetrating slash, which is also a really fantastic movement skill. You get lots of max use counts. This gets even higher at the legendary level, and the cooldown's not as good as roll, but it does move you very quickly. So this is roll, this is penetrating slash. So together they help get you around the map very quickly. And who doesn't like to go fast? And for our attack seal, we are going to use seal of critical chance if we are not crit capped. If you are close to or crit capped, I would use the seal of condensed elements. Moving on to our links, we have Thorn Explosion here as our primary skill. First thing I would add would be quick cast to increase our cast speed significantly. This one is great. We're going to be converting to lightning damage since this is a build that focuses on lightning damage with charge release. We also have element damage amplification. You could take this off and put Mana Storm in for more damage if you want, if you have the mana to support it. If not, element damage amplification works great. Lightning penetration is also another really fantastic damage rune here. And then this final slot here is going to be either area effect. So if you're farming, you're going to want to use area effect rune, make your Thorn Explosion larger. If you are going for maximum damage, just put in a concentrated area damage rune. We will then be using our spell activation on spell hit link rune to link to charge release. We are going to be adding the concentrated area damage rune. This one gives a very, very large damage amplification. However, it does dampen the explosion range on the charge release whenever those projectiles explode. Strike, another best in slot rune that you need to have, increases strike damage amplification significantly and lowers cast speed. However, since this is the activated spell, it doesn't matter. Since we're not casting this, we are casting Thorn Explosion. Mana Storm, I would definitely throw that on. And Lightning Penetration is another rune I'm going with here, again, for charge release. And in my opinion, projectile acceleration is something that you really need to have on charge release, at least while you're mapping, just to help you farm much quicker. This is going to increase the speed of your projectiles, make those charge release projectiles travel much faster towards your enemy. So you can see right here kind of how fast they're going. If we were to take this rune off, you can kind of see how much slower they travel. And in my experience, having this projectile acceleration rune speeds up mapping a lot. It just makes it much, much nicer. Some alternative runes, if you're not crit capped, you could take a Find Weakness and put Find Weakness on instead of this Lightning Penetration rune. And if you don't have some of these other runes here, like Mana Storm or Strike, since those are synthesis runes, you could slot in something like Slaughter if your critical rate is like 80% or higher. This is something that will do really well. So moving on, what we are going to need is as little to dexterity as possible. You don't want to put anything into dexterity if you can help it. I have a couple of hybrid armor pieces that require a little bit of dexterity, so that's why I have some here. But in this build, you don't need any at all. Intelligence, you're going to get enough intelligence to run charge release. Charge release does require a good amount of intelligence, so only get enough to run that and nothing more, and then put the rest into strength. Thorn Explosion is going to also require a high amount of strength, but we should be able to get that since this is what we are going to prioritize in our stats. Now, it is going to be very, very difficult to meet your strength and intelligence requirements for this build for Thorn Explosion and Charge Release and still get 200 dexterity, which a lot of people like to go for to get the 40% damage node and then some of these other nodes. If you can get it, great, but it will take a lot of effort and a lot of investment into your character. So don't worry about dexterity at all until you get to that point. I'm not going to go into each Zodiac tree, but I will note a couple things. If you need some mana, Unos in tree 3 is great to get some mana efficiency. Also, tree 7, you can get more mana efficiency here. I like Scent a lot to get this extra area of effect since both Charge Release and Thorn Explosion benefit from area of effect. This is going to make those explosion ranges larger. Also, HP is really important in this game, so in Farmer, I always grab these 5 nodes right here for HP. And I usually always grab these 5 points here for Time of the Hunt, which will give us damage amplification and then a reset on our movement skills. For our specialization, we are 100% going for brilliance. This is by far the best tree for casters, and we are going to be grabbing acceleration, getting this cast speed amplification and nice resource cost dampening, overpower as well, and finally the 6% strike damage amplification. Next up, we will be grabbing this 15% element damage amplification down here. Knowledge is going to give us a nice cast speed and spell damage boost. Sharpness gives us a boost to our crit rate and crit damage. And then finally, I don't have my 9th point yet, but I will be dropping it here. It is a bigger damage boost than going for the area damage amplification. So this is what I'm going for. If you're over crit capped, you can always drop these two and put it into this area damage amp. And then finally, for our third specialization, there's 2 routes you can go here. In Pirate, if your cast speed is pretty good, like 4 or more, I think that this is the slightly better tree. You're going to grab this element damage amplification here, get this damage amplification against debuffed enemies. Shock is a debuff, so we will always have shock up on our enemies as long as they're being hit by charge release, and so that's an extra 5% amp there. And then 5% damage amp against crowd control. And this one might be confusing to some of you, but this additional cold damage equal to 10% of damage on every hit. We're grabbing this instead of the lightning damage down here, even though we do lightning damage, because the way this reads can be confusing, but what it actually means is 10% of our total damage will be applied as cold damage. So even though we're doing lightning damage, we're going to do an additional 10% as cold. And so the reason we're grabbing this is because we want to be able to do things like crowd control the enemy with both lightning and cold, or add status effects. So this additional cold damage is going to give us a chance to do status effects with the cold element in addition to lightning damage, because we get this +2 status effect rate right here. Now this +2 translates to about 1%. So we're going to have a 1% chance on hit to either chill the enemy, freeze the enemy, and bind the enemy now since we have this. The shock rate is already really high from charge release, so no worries there. But if you want more consistent chills, freezes, and binds, then you can take these 2 points out here and drop this amplification and put it up here to get another +2. So like almost another extra percent. So instead of a 1% chance to do the chill, bind, and freeze, you'll have now 2% each. If this is more up your alley, you can do that. I prefer the damage, but you'll see here as we're attacking, yep, he just got chilled, freezed. So now by doing cold damage, we have an additional chance to debuff and crowd control our enemy with chill and freeze. The other route you could go would be waterfall. I'd only do this if you either had very low cast speed or if you had a high amount of barrier. You might want to go this route as well. You could drop your 9 points all the way down here to this element damage amplification and then this cast speed amplification. This is why I'd go here if you had really low cast speed. This can get you up and casting a lot faster. The other reason you might want this is if you had high barrier, like we said. Now, while I won't be giving a full breakdown of gear, charms, and relics, I do want to add this. Since this build does require a lot of stat, when you're gearing, there are daggers that have high stat amounts. And if you're struggling to get the stats you need, you should target a dagger that has the stats implicit option right here. And if you're having struggles with resources, staves will have a resource cost dampening implicit on them. So this would be kind of like your budget option. If you're only wanting to enchant or get one piece of gear, the staff could be good for you. I've been liking it, but most people don't go with this because it is less damage. Now, since I won't be going into detail, all the information on gear and charm stats you should be going for, charm blessings and relic information will be down in the video description. So go ahead down there and check that out. But that is the entire build, the Lightning Thorn Explosion Mage. I love this build. It's a lot of fun. Crazy amounts of damage. And if you're not a big fan of charge release, I get it. It can really, it can be a lot to look at. And I avoided it for a very long time for that reason. But if you cannot stand charge release and you want an alternative, you can always use Lightning Chain. Lightning Chain is not going to do as much damage, and you won't be able to get as many matching blessing effects and tags with it because it does not have the projectile and area damage. But the primary goal of charge release in this build is to add the shock debuff. So Lightning Chain can do that just as good as charge release, if not better, since it hits immediately, but it won't do the amount of damage charge release will do. So keep that in mind. And at lower levels of investment, there's not quite as much a gap between Lightning Chain and charge release. But that's it, guys. If you have any thoughts or questions about the build, let me know in the description. I'd love to hear from you, and I will help you out as best I can if you do have questions. But if the build has helped you out, do me a solid, give me a like and subscribe. But I've got to get back to the grind, so I will catch you guys later.